Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm making a video about how to tank the Everbloom. So this is the point in the videos now where I admit that I was wrong. I guess it's just a feature of these guides. I'm Llarold and I was wrong. With that being said, I loved the Everbloom back in Warlords of Draenor. I was really excited about it becoming a Mythic Plus dungeon. I really wanted this in previous seasons. I voted for it in Shadowlands Season 4. I really wanted that. It was a great heroic dungeon. It was a great challenge mode dungeon. And for the brief period when they implemented Mythic Zero dungeons, kind of midway through Warlords of Draenor, it was a pretty great Mythics dungeon as well. As a Mythic Plus dungeon, I think it could be really good, except for the affixes. But oh my god, does this dungeon interact terribly with Mythic Plus affixes. So not to spoil a future video idea, but this is really the problem with Mythic Plus dungeons. Affixes are bad. They're all downside. There is no fun component to them. They're integrated poorly into dungeons and they just make everything suck. They add nothing to the experience, they only take away. So now let's talk about how affixes ruin this dungeon specifically. All of the dread petals in the first 75% of the dungeon count for on-death affixes, so we're talking bursting, bolstering, and spiteful. They only give 0.33% completion. Mobs this small in most dungeons do not trigger on-death affixes. Imagine every single trash mob in Waycrest Manor casting bursting when it died. That's the Everbloom! This means that all the wonderful pulls where you could grab 8 mobs at once in a single pull end with a caster mob who's bolstered 7 times machine gunning down the rest of your group. It's not good. In the final 25% of the dungeon, the little hapless assistants who just auto attack and punch the tank also count for on-death effects, and they only grant 1% completion. So there is no escape from on-death affixes in this dungeon. They just suck here. In the last week when I was working on this video, it was bursting week. I thought about doing some high-level keys of this dungeon just to get some footage, and you know what? I had footage from previous weeks. I don't have to subject myself to that. I did some low-level ones of last week, 13 and below, so I didn't have to deal with bursting, but I just didn't feel the same experience as intentionally slamming my hand in a car door. With that being said, it's not an awful dungeon. If you exclude affixes, which is cheating, I think it's pretty good. The second boss is very hard for pug groups, but otherwise I think it can be a pretty fun dungeon at some points. It is dangerous though, and the route you use can vary quite a bit, so there's a good bit of freedom when it comes to which packs you pull and which packs you skip. Now for the usual disclaimer before I walk through the route. My goal is to talk about what I do to maximize the group's chances of finishing the dungeon easily and relatively quickly and limit the possibility for other players to make mistakes. This is specifically oriented toward pugs, and it's definitely not the most efficient route possible, and that's fine. You can pull more aggressively if your group is up for it, or if the affixes are suitable for that. With that being said, this route should be fine all the way from a +2 up to about a 24, 25. For higher levels, I would be a lot more aggressive throughout the entire dungeon. And here is my MDT route for this dungeon. It's on the screen right now. I will put a pastebin link to copy the import string into your MDT in the pinned comment. I once again recommend using MDT. It's a great add-on for planning out routes. I perform a big pull at the start of the dungeon. I drag the first little pack down the hill. I will interrupt the naturalist and grab a melded berserker along the way, and I make sure we use Bloodlust. Bringing that naturalist down the hill is quite a lot easier if you're on a demon hunter or a paladin. You can interrupt him from range, or just on a DK, you can grip it down. It could be a little bit of work. You might need some coordination from other people in your group if you're on one of the other tanks. I chain out of that pull into the next pull, and we basically just pull our way toward the first boss, grabbing a handful of pulls around this opening area. We're clearing out all of these packs with the dread petals in them and the naturalists and all of those little casters there. Now here's a quick sidebar about Gnarl route. Most groups skip him, especially at higher levels. I have skipped him in this route. If he accidentally gets pulled, or if you just want to do him, that's okay. He grants 8.33% completion, so he allows you to skip an entire extra pull, and he only has 2 abilities, so he's really not a terrible mob to pull, but most players don't know how to kill him because high-level groups skip him because he has a huge health bar. So here's how he works. He makes you stack up as a group, and that's what you do. You just stack up as a group, all 5 players. He casts roots, you AoE them down, He casts silent circles, you step out of those and stack back up. That's it, rinse repeat until he's dead. Druid shape-shifting and freedoms and Tiger's Lust and all the usual stuff that would instantly break roots works on this, so he's really not difficult to deal with, but most players don't pull him because he's a big fat single target mob in a dungeon full of massive AoE pulls. Obviously you shouldn't pull him with other stuff on like bolstering or spiteful weeks, or he will root people and they'll get killed by spitefuls, or he'll have infinite damage from bolstering. The first boss's room is absolutely rotten with caster mobs. So if I'm on a Paladin, a Death Knight, or a Vengeance Demon Hunter, I will gather them up into 2 double pulls and use Silence or Grips to drag them around. If I'm on the other 3 tanks and the Grips interrupts haven't been good thus far, I might split this room into 3 pulls. Like I will pull the Pat and 1 pack together, and then I will just pull the other 2 packs separately so that the casters don't just obliterate the group. After the first boss, I pull most of the trash in the main area right at the start of the dungeon. The way I pull it is entirely dependent on what the weekly affixes are. If there aren't any awful on death effects like bursting or bolstering, I do kind of go a bit wild. If those are active, I play it very cautiously, especially on fortified weeks. The Twisted Abominations hit really hard, and they use Poisonous Claws on the tank, so if you're Monk, Pally, or Druid, you can dispel yourself, and that'll prevent a lot of damage. The Melded Berserkers really only have one mechanic. They just like to jump out onto ranged players and whirlwind on them. You could use CCs or knocks to prevent this, and that's a good idea whenever possible. Ursol's Vortex and Death Grip are really good for locking these guys down, and they really aren't dangerous to the tank, just the people that they will leap out to and whirlwind on. So, generally speaking, I kind of want to pull a lot of them at once and just CC them to prevent them from killing the ranged DPS and the healer. Just be sure not to overpull them if your group doesn't have the CC ready to lock them down, or if it's like an enraging week. I hug the left side on the way to the second boss's room. I want to skip the big nasty pack over on the right side there and just grab the 2 mob patrol. I clean up the trash pull that's in the second boss's room, and at this point, I'm looking to have 75% completion before pulling the second boss. You have a couple of percent left over at the end just in case, but if you're under 73 at this point, you will be short. You do need to pull more. In the area around the third boss, I pull as quickly as the affixes allow. Again, on bolstering weeks, I try to take it 1 pull at a time. Otherwise, I try to move through quickly, grabbing the named mobs in the front of the area and their hapless assistants. The hapless assistants, they just auto attack and then they do like a tank strike. They hit quite hard, but that is the only thing that they do. So you can pull as many as you're capable of living through, and that's pretty good unless there's like a bursting, bolstering situation going on. I like to get all the hapless assistants that are over to the left, and then finish up with the 3 mages that are all in front of the boss. Once the third boss dies, you have 35 seconds of RP before you can go through the gateway to the final boss. So during that time, you can kill the hapless assistants that are up the hill from the third boss. There are 6 of them up there, and they're all worth exactly 1%, so as long as you are at 94% or higher at this point, you are good. Pull as many as you need to get through and hit 100%, kill the final boss, and that's the dungeon. Now let's cover the best Bloodlust points. I prefer to Bloodlust on the first pull, and I chain into the next pull as quickly as possible once that opening pull is dead. I also want to lust the third boss if it's available, because she is a nightmare. If it's not up, lusting the fourth boss is also fine. This means you get 1 lust spot in between, and I really prefer to do that on the trash before the second boss because there's tons of room to make huge pulls. Timing your lusts is something you kind of need to feel out on the fly when playing with pugs, especially in this dungeon. If you're moving kind of fast but not crazy fast, you might be able to lust the first pull, the second boss, and the final boss. Now if you're zooming and you're just not going to get 3 lusts in this dungeon, that's totally fine. That's a great problem to have. As long as you can lust the first pull and the third or fourth boss, you're doing really well. Some players like to hold lust for the first boss because he has a double damage taken phase, and it makes your DPS number look high if you lust that part of the boss, I guess. That phase is one of the easiest phases of any boss in any Mythic Plus dungeon ever, really. It's basically just a training dummy with a damage amp, so I really don't think it's worth holding for that point at all, but you can if people really want to. You will get more damage out of Bloodlusting on the trash though, and unless the group is moving slowly, you will probably just lock yourself to 2 casts by doing it on the first boss. Now let's talk about that first boss, Witherbark. He has 2 phases, and neither of them are very complicated. Phase 1 has 2 main mechanics. He casts Parched Gasp on you. It's just a cone that deals a ton of nature damage. and you want to use defensive cooldowns to mitigate it. The other mechanic causes your party members to drop vines. They just want to fan those out behind the boss. During phase 2, the boss goes inactive and takes double damage, so I prefer to hold cooldowns for that section of the fight. Phase 2 has one mechanic. The boss spawns water balls that move across the room toward him, and if they touch the vine pools that are on the ground from phase 1, they spawn an ad, and all the ad does is auto attack, so you just pick up the ads and pull them onto the boss to cleave them down. If the balls touch the boss, he gets 25% of his energy back. So you have an incentive to kill the balls before they touch the boss, assuming they won't just hit a water pool, vine pool, whatever. Other than that, he's basically just a training dummy. Eventually enough balls will spawn, and they'll hit him and send him back to phase 1 once he hits 100 energy. And in that case, I just spin him back to the wall and wait until he hits phase 2 again, about 30-40 seconds. Rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. As for taking this boss, I start out by pulling him straight to the wall, I face him toward it, and then that's basically it for the fight. I use defensive cooldowns to mitigate the breaths during the active phases, and I pick up ads during the down phases, and I try to help DPS the boss and kill water balls as appropriate. That's it. He's very, very basic. One of the simplest boss fights ever in Mythic Plus, really. Ancient Protectors are the second boss, and they're probably the hardest boss in the dungeon for less coordinated groups, one of the hardest bosses for less coordinated groups I've ever seen, because they have some positional requirements and interrupt requirements, and the punishment for failing either of those is very bad. For good, organized groups, this boss is very, very simple. It hits hard, so I wouldn't say it's easy, but it is simple. The boss fight has 3 enemies. Technically, it's 3 bosses at once. We'll start with Dulhu, the tank boss. He auto-attacks the tank, and he has one skill, Noxious Charge. Noxious Charge deals a ton of magic damage and spawns poison pools under all the players in the group. The pools spawn based on where everyone is at the end of the boss's charge. So if you try to use a skill like Transcendence to dodge the charge and teleport back to melee range of one of the other bosses, you'll leave a pool under the boss you just transcended to. Instead, you want to use a defensive cooldown, eat the charge, and then instantly move out of it. It's also super important, I mean critically important, that none of your other party members, especially the melee DPS, are just camping out under the other 2 bosses. This is one of the 3 main points of failure in this fight, and it is by far the most common. Other than that, you want to maintain threat, keep him near the other boss in between his charges, and then that's really all there is to him. He's not complicated, he hits hard, but he is simple. The other 2 bosses in this fight are Earthshaper Telu and Life Warden Gola. They each have 2 main spells that they cast and an uninterruptible group-wide damage effect that they channel. They alternate between doing the channel damage and casting spells, so both of them will never be actively spamming spells at the same time, but one will always be radiating damage onto the group, so basically it's a healer check. While one boss is channeling damage, the other spam casts a damage spell at random players. The active boss will also cast a special spell 2 times that the party needs to interrupt. Once one caster has finished his channel, he will activate and the other one will switch off. He'll start channeling. Earthshaper Telu's special spell is Toxic Bloom, which stuns the entire group for 4 seconds. It usually causes a wipe if it goes off, so you really want to be sure to kick this. Life Warden Gola's special spell is Revitalize, which heals a friendly boss for millions of damage and applies a heal over time effect. He casts this almost immediately after activating, and this will overlap with a charge from Dulhu, so it's on your party members to interrupt this cast unless you're playing a Prot Paladin or a Blood DK and you can hit him from range with an Avenger's Shield or a Mind Freeze. If Revitalize goes off, it will heal for a bunch, and it usually goes off on Earthshaper Telu. This is going to make the fight last a lot longer, but you can at least dispel the hot and lessen that slightly if you're playing a Blood Elf or you have like a Priest or a Shaman in the group, somebody who's aware of that, but didn't get the interrupt for some reason. Earthshaper Telu is the first active boss, so you want to start out by grabbing Dulhu and dragging him to Earthshaper Telu. Other than when you're dealing with Dulhu's charges, you can keep these 2 guys together until Earthshaper Telu dies, then you bring Dulhu over to Life Warden Gola. Now, once Earthshaper Telu dies, the fight isn't completely over, but the difficulty goes way, way down. At that point, you want to just focus down Life Warden Gola. Once he's done, you kill Dulhu, and then the fight is over. Archmage Sol is the next boss. She has 3 fairly simple abilities that overlap in ways that make them all significantly more dangerous. She's kind of a piece of classic WoW game design where they telegraph a concept using the boss's trash mobs, and then combine them in a way that forces you to apply everything you've learned in the easier setting under a much higher level of pressure. Her first ability is Cinderbolt Storm. It deals a lot of unavoidable fire damage and spawns fire pools on the ground. Because that damage is unavoidable, and it really hits quite hard, this is the main reason that you want to Bloodlust this fight. You want to just get the fight over as quickly as you can before her Cinderbolt Storm starts killing people. The second ability she uses is Glacial Fusion. It spawns 2 circles of ice balls with gaps in them. The ice balls collapse to a single point over a couple of seconds, so you want to run out of them before they do. If you touch an ice ball, you get stunned for 4 seconds, and there's a very real possibility that you'll die. Her third ability is Spatial Compression, which throws out an arcane orb that deals a massive amount of damage in a small circle and pulls everyone in the area, like in the entire fight area, toward that circle for about a second. She alternates between these 3 abilities throughout the fight, and after her first Cinderbolt Storm, she casts 2 of them at a time. She will occasionally cast a Fireball, Frostbolt, or Arcane Blast at you as well. These aren't interruptible, but they can be spell reflected, so Protection Warriors get a good chunk of free damage on this fight. The overlap between Glacial Fusion and Spatial Compression is by far the hardest combo in the fight, and it happens about 45 seconds in. Now, DKs can easily just Death's Advance to ignore the pull from Spatial Compression, but most other tanks have to either position themselves so that the grip helps pull them out of a Glacial Fusion circle, or time a skill like Heroic Leap or Infernal Strike to go, like, basically as soon as the grip starts, like literally 1/1000th of a second after you start getting gripped, you then hit Heroic Leap or Infernal Strike to cancel the grip. This was part of the Mythic Denathrius fight, one of the like more difficult parts of any Mythic raid boss fight ever, like timing leaps to cancel a knockback by a boss. So having to do this in like a Mythic Plus dungeon is kind of surprising that they put this sort of overlap in there, but it's pretty cool to be able to flex that level of player skill. I try to pull the boss away from her starting spot, as the pylons around there can get in the way of running out of Glacial Fusion rings. There isn't really any other trick to her other than just surviving the Glacial Fusion and Spatial Compression overlaps, and just simply living through the Cinderbolt Storms. You just want to pull her into an open space where there's room around her for your DPS to maneuver safely, and then just not get killed by her mechanics. Okay, Yalnu is the final boss in the Everbloom, and he has 3 main mechanics. Again, he's not a super complicated fight. You are assisted in this fight by a bunch of Fire Mage NPCs. The main NPC, Lady Baihu, channels a fire debuff onto the boss that makes him take 300% extra damage at all times, so quadruple damage. This is great, and it is the reason why your damage meters on this fight will look insane. Colossal Blow is the boss's first main mechanic. It is the one he uses on the tank. It's a giant frontal cone, it deals a ton of damage, and it stuns you if it hits you. But it has a really long cast time and it's very easy to dodge. You should do that. There were some bugs with this ability, like quite a few bugs with this ability for the first, I think, about month of this season, where sometimes it would cast on pets, sometimes it would desync and the boss would be facing one way, but his cone would be facing out and kill the healer. It sucked, but most of all of it really seems like it's been fixed now, so that's great. Even if you're not in the cone, it also deals a ton of group-wide damage. So using group-wide defensive cooldowns like Rallying Cry can be really helpful. Darkness can be too, Anti-Magic Zone can be as well. It is spell damage. But you have to jump out of the cone and drop Darkness onto your party members at the last second, so that makes it a little bit tougher to use. The main emphasis here is that you always want to face the boss away from the party at any point when you're actively tanking him. Verdant Eruption spawns a big green circle, and you don't want to be in that when it expires either, as it will deal damage and stun you, just like the Colossal Blow. Once it expires, it summons an ad. The ad attacks Lady Baihu, the main Fire Mage NPC. She can't channel her fire debuff while the ad is up, so it's extremely important to swap to the ad and burn it down so she can continue burning the boss so you can do damage to the boss. The ad also pulls this party-wide damage every 3 seconds, and overlaps between that and the Colossal Blow, ticking around the same time, can kill people. So you have really 2 big incentives, an offensive one and a defensive one, to kill that ad. The boss's final mechanic is Genesis. He stops doing anything and he just starts channeling. A bunch of flowers spawn, and when he ends his channel, they emerge and they start blasting. You can just kill the flowers before they spawn by stomping on their petals. Use all of your mobility skills and help stomp on all the flowers. You want to get the ones that are sort of in front of the boss, near where you're tanking initially, but then you can fan out and go pick other flowers up. and you want to get back in a position to point the boss away from the group once the channel has ended, but you have several seconds of leeway before he casts another colossal blow. If the group managed to miss any flowers, which they really shouldn't, it's okay. You can just pick those guys up as quickly as you can and CC them and burn them down. The boss is pretty simple. He's not easy. He will do tons of damage on high-level tyrannical keys, but mechanically he's just not very complicated. I start out by immediately facing him away from the group. I was gonna say more, but really that is about all there is to it. I start out by facing him away. When another mechanic happens, I react to it. Then I face the cone away and I dodge it. I focus the ad, I face the boss away. I stomp the flowers, I face the boss away. That's pretty much it. If you can do anything to help the healer with off healing or group cooldowns, you know, you're a druid, you're a paladin, you should do that. But for the millionth time already, this fight is basically just a throughput check for the healer, and it's not really all that complicated for the tank. And that's the Everbloom. It's one of the dungeons of all time. I wish that Blizzard had done a better job of implementing and testing and working on Mythic Plus affixes in this dungeon, because I think it really could have been a good, fun Mythic Plus dungeon. In some weeks it is. I like a lot of the stuff that's happening here. I think the boss reworks were pretty effective, and I think it's really just on-death affixes that have absolutely ruined this dungeon. They're horrendous here, and that's like half of the Mythic Plus weeks anymore, so it's kind of a disappointing result for such a promising dungeon, and a dungeon I really looked on fondly. I still don't hate it, I just see what could have been, and I am left wanting more. Hopefully they will learn from this when remaking future past dungeons. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.